You're listening to Ecosysteming, the podcast redefining economic development through the lens of equitable entrepreneurship. Join NC Idea's Tom Rue as he engages with entrepreneurs and experts who are challenging the status quo and driving lasting change.
Today, I'd like to welcome John Austin to the show. Been looking forward to this conversation, even though we've worked together for, I would say, more than several years, many years. John, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Good to see you again.
I think I'm going to do that again because I think I underserved you in that introduction. When I say I'm happy to talk to John Austin today, what I should say is I'm happy to talk to the OG, the founding member of the Curmudgeon Club, one of the original godfathers of entrepreneurship in the Triangle, John Austin, or how he's better known and more affectionately known by his friends, the John Austin. So, John, thanks in all seriousness. Thanks for joining us. For the listeners of the podcast, I should mention, by way of giving you your introduction, you were here before I started almost 9 years ago, when it was a smaller, yet still mighty group of people doing this kind of work. And so I think for the benefit of everybody listening, let's just start with a little bit biographical, like, when you got to the Triangle and how you found yourself endearing yourself in the hearts and minds of these aspiring entrepreneurs in the Triangle that were off trying to change the world with really big companies.
Sure. Being an old guy, it might take a while, but I'll try and keep it brief for you. Actually moved to the Triangle in 81 to go to grad school at Carolina, and we never left town. Got a master's in computer science, got involved with a project that eventually got licensed by a company. And that was my first involvement with the local startup community. This was back in the 1980s, I guess, early 90s. Did a couple tech startups in the software and hardware space. Eventually in 2011, I started having some conversations with Justin Kosierski and Glenn Kaplan about a project they were working on called Joystick Labs, which was a accelerator for video game studios. This was back in the day when accelerators were just getting started, and they saw that there was a lot of video game activity here and these accelerator projects. And so talked to them, eventually led that project for a year. One of the investors in that entity was NC Idea. Unfortunately, Joystick Labs didn't quite work out. We morphed that into a program called Groundwork Labs, and NC Idea funded that. And it was sort of a pre-accelerator. Like an accelerator, we would do 3-month sessions with aspiring first-time founders. We didn't take an equity stake, but we did offer it for free, which goes back to NC Idea's nonprofit model. So worked with NC Idea on that, eventually got more and more entwined with NC Idea. Eventually it became an NC Idea program. And then I wound up spending 10, 11 years with NC Idea, mostly running programs like the Labs program, doing a couple other things that you'd ask me to do. And then a couple years ago, I retired so I could spend some time with doing other things, but I also still am involved in the startup community, still do a little consulting work for you guys. You're nice enough to let me hang around a little bit and still be a part of the startup community.
No, you're soft selling that. I mean, nice enough to let you hang around. I mean, you know the adage, right? Once in the family, always in the family. So you're part of the fabric of the organization. So you're soft selling it there, but you've always been humble in that regard. You mentioned kind of the joystick and a little more broadly, like the accelerator model, in the ecosystems, and there was a certain flavor, if you will, to that in a historical context. Why don't you talk a little bit about what the ecosystem was like that circa 2010, 2011 as Joystick? Because, spoiler alert, I'm going to ask you a little bit later, how it's changed since and what we see it now. So, help the listener level set on what that looked like as an ecosystem then.
Sure. Well, I mean, even going back further, when I first got involved in the '90s, there wasn't the sort of interactions that were going on back then. I mean, partly we didn't have as much capability with the internet to have those interactions. In the '90s, there was CED. CED would run some interesting programs, and there was a bunch of founders sort of scattered around, and came in contact every once in a while. And in the early 2010s, when we started to see a couple accelerator programs emerge, co-working spaces emerge, you started to see a whole lot more of this interaction amongst founders. And being that kind of introverted engineer, what do I need to go network for? I was really kind of skeptical, what do you need co-working for? And getting involved with Groundwork Labs, we were located in the American Underground across the hall from NC IDEA, and starting to see those interactions take place. And looking back as when I was running a startup tech company and just kind of looking around the room, and we were just ourselves, but seeing in this new environment the ability of somebody to just walk down the hall and talk to another founder who might have those same problems, same issues. But that's what started to emerge through the 2010s, sort of a really exciting time for the Triangle as the startup ecosystem really started to emerge and grow.
Yeah. Now, do you think that it just kind of happened organically, or do you think there was some sort of leadership or formality to it? Like, were the people here that were involved in that work, was it, where everybody reading the latest in tech-based economic development, the T-Bed papers that were coming out at the time, and, involving all the tech transfer offices at the universities and mobilizing the funds, and was it all just a one big kumbaya hand-holding session and drum circle?
I don't know about that.
No. Come on, really?
Yeah. And, and certainly, there were, many leaders, CED for many years. NC IDEA at that time was sort of one of the players in it, but certainly was just focused on the grant program. We can come back to that. Chris Hively and the Startup Factory and the work that those folks did, the American Underground, what is now called Raleigh Founded. And the name escapes me of what they were when they started. I think there was a lot of good interactions between many of those players. There was also the three universities. They battle on the football field and the basketball court, and they also, have their own things going on. And I did not see at that time a lot of interaction between the universities. And the other, I think, unique issue that this area has in trying to build a research triangle ecosystem is there are also Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, now Cary, not back then. Each one of those is trying to build their own startup ecosystem, and trying to get everybody to pull together from that standpoint, I think, is tough. And even beyond that, Research Triangle Park's not that big. There's not that many funders. I'm not sure if even the Research Triangle Park is big enough to sort of pull its weight compared to someplace like in Austin. And that's why I think you've got to look even across the entire state and have all of us pulling together and working together.
Not to cast doubt on anybody's intentions back in the day, but do you think there was, and let me come at it this way. When I started, like I said, going on almost 9 years now, it didn't feel to me then that there was a lot of concern from the Triangle about what was happening in other parts of the state. Am I misreading that, or was there a time that predates, me joining NCIDEA where people in the Triangle were caring about what was happening in the Triad and, Asheville and Wilmington?
No, I don't think. I think each community was sort of worried about themselves.
And that's not a bad thing, right? Like, I mean, that's self-interest is not always a bad thing. It's, you got to survive first, right? Before you can even have the opportunity to look beyond your boundaries. So,
right. And, I look back, and to me, one of the things when you started here, to take a step back and look at what NCIDEA was, from 05, 06,
05.
when it got started, the focus was on technology-based, venture-backable startup companies. And NCIDEA really looked at our grant application. At the time, all we had was the seed grant. Really looked at the work we were doing through that lens. And if you look at startups through that lens, that's mostly going to be in the Triangle. And so 90% of the work that NCIDEA did, not because they were trying to work in the Triangle, the mission has always been statewide. But if you look at it through that lens, you're going to wind up working with 90% companies in the Triangle. And, one of the things when you started, we sort of changed that focus and tried to recognize our mission, or not recognize, we knew our mission was across the state, but try and fulfill that mission across the state. And if you're going to do that, you've got to look beyond technology-based startups. It's going to be kind of rare to find a software company in Mount Airy, right? So you have to, look beyond that technology-based venture-backable startups and opening the tent to other startups where you can have a huge impact in smaller communities like Mount Airy or Rocky Mount.
Yeah. I think the way I've described it, at the time, and it's 05, by the way, is what we are officially kind of declaring. So not this year's summit, but next year's summit, we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary. So that'll be probably hopefully a roaring good time for everybody. But I really think that we were a niche player, right? Like, we did one thing really well. We built a process that could take, to your point, technology-based, venture backable. Yeah, it's contagious.
Sorry about that.
Quite all right. But like, it was a very tried and true model. And to be fair to the organization in a historical context, that model was playing out across the country. I was working at Kauffman, the Kauffman Foundation at the time, and traveling not just the country, but the world, doing ecosystem building. And the model that was working here in funding, two guys, from state with a B2B SaaS app that, fill in the blank, that was happening nationally, because that's where technology-based economic development was at the time. It's only, I think, been more recently, and by recent, I mean like in the last 10 years, that, it's been evolving, and everything continues to evolve. Not the least of which NCIDEA.
Well, and to be fair, it was only a couple folks too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we're more than double the size. When I remember joining, it was Andrea, you, Reagan, and me, right? And John.
Yep.
John was a fractional CFO
Yep.
to us on loan from IFP. So I get that. So, okay, that's the history. Let's talk about this new guy shows up, says, hey, let's try to do something a little different, a little more. What were your thoughts? And, you're retired and you're a straight shooter, as everybody knows. So not that you ever during your tenure, note that you ever held back on your criticism of, my decisions and what we've done. But how would you reflect on what we have evolved to become and what we do?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what we thought of you. Well, I should have talked to Andrea before I showed up for this and compared notes as to what we thought when this guy walked in from Ohio. So I think as we just said, the organization was very focused on doing one thing really well from 2005 till about 2011. Make seed grants, give folks the money.
Which for the listeners, seed grant is $50,000. So there's going to be people listening to this that don't know about specifically what we do. So seed grants are $50,000 that we do through a competitive grant application twice a year. Sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to put that context in there.
And interestingly enough, still $50,000, but that's another thing we might want to talk about. But it was make the grant, let the company perform. Hopefully, they would raise money. And then in 2012, when we started the Groundwork Labs programs, the first time we actually did a lot more of help instead of just money, and starting engaging with founders. And I think that helped raise our visibility and the work we were doing, because it was we engaged many more people in the community through that. Always have engaged people in the community through our grant review process. So then when you came in, I think the key thing that differentiated what you wanted to do was this reminder that our mission was statewide. And then a lot of things, I think, flowed from that. If you're going to work statewide, again, you have to think about things besides technology companies. The second thing is, if you're going to work statewide, there's a lot of places that don't have the entrepreneurial, that at the time did not have the entrepreneurial ecosystem that places like the Triangle and Charlotte had. And so that's when we started the ecosystem grant program, trying to help organizations in those parts of the state increase their capabilities. And one of the really great things we did was that we didn't sit here in Durham, excuse me, and say, we're from Durham, we're here to help, but make grants to organizations in these regions that understood what was going on in the region, but didn't have the resources to do what they needed to do. And so by doing that, that can increase the startup density in those regions, which can then allow us to better fulfill that statewide mission. So that focus on the state, I think, was the big change that happened when you arrived. I think the next big change, be interested to see if you think this made a big difference. So you're around for a few years and COVID hits. And I think I recall, you kind of going into that first board meeting right after, I might be exaggerating that, but sometime around then. And I think there was a genuine fear on everybody's part. Well, actually, let me back up one step. We're a private foundation. We have a nest egg invested in the stock market. That nest egg generates funds that we use to run our programs. So COVID hits, everybody's afraid the stock market's going down. We're afraid what's going to happen. Should we, withdraw? Should we pull back like everybody else was doing at the time? Should we pull back? And the board, under your brilliant leadership, Tom, I might add.
You
got to make sure.
You don't have to do that. I appreciate that, but
I still want some consulting contracts, so I got to still be nice to you. Seriously, the board made a bold decision to double down, and this was a time when everybody else was pulling back. It's a time when entrepreneurship has an opportunity to flourish because of these external forces where everybody's losing their job. What are they going to do? And that really, I think, kind of propelled that statewide vision another level.
I appreciate that. I'm going to tweak just a little bit how you said it. I think first what happened was, like everybody else, we worried about the people we serve. Right? Because they are on the front lines, the economic front lines. And like so many companies, like there were a few that were in a previous grant cycle that were like in a, public facing business. Right. And we knew that would just be threatened immediately and overnight. And we saw that in our own grantees. And so it was, the team, including you, who at the time said, yeah, other PFs, private foundations, and philanthropy, out of self-preservation mode, they're pulling back because the IRS allows you to do an underspend carry forward. You can underspend what's required by law, and you can do that actually into perpetuity as long as you're spending $1 or more every subsequent year. So a lot of foundations did that, and we kind of said, this could cut into the endowment, but if people don't survive this, I mean, what are we really doing? Why are we here if not to serve? And then to the credit of the board, the team came to the board and said, we actually think this is a time to double down. And we have been now for 4 consecutive years. We've been overspending nearly double the IRS required minimum of 5%. And it's impacting our balance sheet. And, we eat our own dog food here. We're entrepreneurial. Nothing's promised tomorrow. So let's make sure we get today right. And I think that's driven a lot of our behavior. What do you think has been our riskiest bet in doing this kind of work? We've had a couple. I'll stall for you, and I'll share a story that's maybe not as much in the public. But like I said, we eat our own dog food. We're entrepreneurial. That means we take risks. And we piloted a program to help people doing crowdfunding.
Oh yeah.
Right. And because there was a minute where there was a lot of energy on that. And so, and we're lucky, North Carolina's lucky to have some thought leaders in that space. And they approached us and said, hey, let's help you, put this out there. And we did. And for reasons I certainly don't understand, I'm not smart enough to understand, it just didn't get the traction, right? We just didn't see, people beating down a path to our door. So we discontinued that. But hopefully I've stalled long enough to give you an opportunity to reflect on what you think our riskiest, bet has been.
Yeah. So following up on that wasn't that risky because we did this little tiny pilot that took, some of Amy's time and, few tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, we did the same thing with our microgrant program, which was a $10,000 grant for companies that weren't yet ready for seed grant. We piloted that with just a few grants to see what happened. And that one worked, thank goodness. So when you talk about riskiest bet, I think of, we spent $1 million on, on some unproven approach to entrepreneurship, and it didn't work. And I think we've actually been fairly, again, entrepreneurial in doing pilots and, MVPs, right, and testing and seeing what our customers need. And so, when I think of riskiest bet, I think of pouring a bunch of money at something and it didn't work. And I can't really think of a time we tried that.
Fair enough. I don't want to force an answer that's not there.
So what do you think? So what do you think has been your riskiest bet?
Well, I'll tell you something that I never would have thought was risky. But as kind of societal norms and climate has changed and we become more tribal and things get a little crazy, in addition to, making this commitment to be truly statewide and engage, and we did pour millions of dollars and continue to pour millions of dollars into this statewide ecosystem partner program. But we also, as a team and as a board, authentically stacked hands on saying that equity has to be at the, foundation of everything we do. So, one of the things we did, which actually was the impetus for the micro grant program, was to track, how many women and minority founders and rural founders were coming through and winning grants. 10 years ago, 90% of our grants went to, white males in the triangle. And then I like to say tongue in cheek, we'd screw up and give a grant to a white guy in Charlotte every once in a while. And that really was the grant making process. Fast forward 9 years, we are now about 70% of all of our grants go to women, minority, and rural founders. And the important thing here is to remember we achieve that not by handicapping or excluding any demographic. So there's not a button or language on our website, for the seed and micro application that says, 2 white dudes from Carolina need not apply. It's not the case at all. And I got to be very clear on that, because our communications around equity have, for some, clouded their understanding of what we do, that they think this is some sort of, diversity exercise, and, we no longer serve their interests. I'm still stunned by a coffee conversation I had almost a year ago. I don't want to embarrass anybody, so I'm not going to drop the name, but it's a big university, and the person leading the entrepreneurship efforts there said, "Yeah, I've told our students not to even bother applying for an NCIDEA grant." And I sat back, I almost did a spit take. And like, for one thing, first of all, like, this particular university has a high percentage of women and minority students. So even if you accept that premise at its base, right, you would have eligible students. So risky is in the sense that now, over time, DEI is under attack, the Fearless Fund case, like, being openly committed to equitable economic development that, helps rise the tide for everybody, that now seems controversial, at least in some circles, right? And there can be blowback on that. As you know, it was the premise of a 2-year-long slog with the IRS when they came after us a couple of years ago. And I'll never forget the quote, right, when they said, "Whereas the work of the foundation is admirable, it doesn't rise to the standard of charitable." And that was our premise and our defense, to say, yeah, well, maybe you're not thinking that through, right? Spoiler alert, we prevailed. So I think that we continue to live by our values. It shouldn't be risky, but at least in the current zeitgeist, it's feeling a little risky.
Yeah, I think now that you put it in that lens, the risks the organization have taken have not been financial risks, but have been risks in directional changes. Even going back to, okay, we're going to work statewide. Oh, we're going to make ecosystem grants. Oh, we're going to make sure we focus on underrepresented entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Back to the ecosystem grants, and, you were saying that, like, we were doing it in a locally relevant context. I don't know if you remember our first issuance of the RFP. I got a phone call from an applicant who said, there's an error in your ecosystem application. And I remember, arrogantly thinking, I wrote that. How could there be an error? How dare you say so? And I said, well, what's the error with it? And he said, it's only 2 pages long. And I had to laugh, because I was like, oh, right. Yeah. Because if there's one thing I learned working at a very large foundation, whose assets under management are measured in billions of dollars, you can force a would-be applicant into unholy yoga poses with this assumption of complete knowledge. We've got the money, so we know. So to the point you made earlier, right? We were sitting here in Durham, and we're going to tell Robeson County, one of the poorest counties in the state that doesn't have the population density, any of the entrepreneurial amenities we take for granted in the Triangle, we're going to presume to tell them what they have to do to activate, their local ecosystem. Whatever is beyond arrogant for a word, that's what that is. And I would just say more plainly, it's kind of stupid that we should take that approach. And really, I think one of the things that we are leading nationally is in this, they call it trust-based philanthropy today. I would put ours as a little bit more, not to quote Ronald Reagan, but trust but verify philanthropy, right? So we're going to trust you to tell us how you're going to serve these historically underserved people so that we can help them get to, economic emancipation through entrepreneurship. But we're also going to verify the impact and that you are capable of doing, what you're doing, and accept the fact that not every time is going to be a home run. We have to be happy, in particular in our more rural communities. We have to be happy with singles and doubles and the occasional strikeout, to torture a sports metaphor, because I'm a big sporting guy, right? So let me get really kind of philosophical now as we try to land this plane. Oh dear is right. No, I mean, all kidding aside, like what do you think the future, like, what would you like to ask somebody that has a deep invested stake in NC IDEA? And I will never be able to thank you enough for that and what you've done for the organization. But what's your hopes for the next several years? Choose whatever number you want.
It's interesting because, we used to talk about this every day, right? If not, lots and lots of conversations about where this is all headed. And now for the last 2 years, not been on the top of mind, not been top of mind for me, though I know it is for you, but continues to be able to expand and reach startup founders all over the state and help them get to the point where they can grow their ideas into startups, into companies that make real impact in their communities.
That's a great answer. The reason I'm asking it to you is just yesterday I spoke at this forum that was sponsored by MasterCard. And as a panelist, we were all asked that question. And, I would agree, of course, with everything you just said. And, we're going to keep on keeping on. The kind of one step above that I'm hopeful that we can help others find courage is redefining best practices in economic development. As you and the rest of the team like to make fun of me, a triggering topic is, traditional economic development, where we'll throw tens and in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars in financial incentives to bribe some company to move here. And, we incur all of the hardship, the burdens, to the infrastructure. Everything is immediate from a negative standpoint, and the upside is deferred, and the ROI is measured in decades, right? Yet we have founders toiling away in obscurity with very, very limited resources, comparatively speaking, that are the greatest creator of new jobs in the state and in the country, right? Secretary Marshall's office just put out a report a couple of weeks ago that should have been a clarion call for everybody, every policymaker in this state, where, first of all, she reminded everybody that startups have been going at a record pace for 5 years now in the state of North Carolina. And if we helped only 5% of those firms that are 5 years old or younger, if we helped only 5% of them get to a revenue run rate above $50,000 a year, which is relatively modest, if 5% were able to grow to that base, the economic impact to the state would be between $1.5 and $2 billion annually. Annually. So think about that, right? When we're considering how we allocate resources, and it's right there in front of us. What it doesn't come with is like ribbon cutting ceremonies and good pressers and optics, right? And so my hope is that we can continue to be this example that this is a smart thing to invest in. And if we are patient, if we keep our focus and shoulder to the stone, that we could just have a return that exceeds anything that the old thinking of smokestack chasing has been doing for years.
And be willing to accept that some of these aren't going to work out.
Oh, yeah.
Many of them aren't going to work out. And that's part of the challenge here, is getting folks to understand that, they're not all going to work. But man, the ones that do are going to have disproportionate impact on what's going on. Why should we be, sending money to I won't name all of these companies that we've sent money
Right.
to, or at least deferred taxes to bring their company here, when we can grow so many outstanding companies here and help them to thrive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, as you know, and it's just going to take courage. As I said, my closing thought at yesterday's panel, there was a senior staffer for one of our two senators, and I said to him, there's this notion at the moment, this controversy around, states shouldn't be making equity investments, and we shouldn't be picking winners and losers. And I said, well, NC IDEA has funded about 600 companies over its almost 20 years in existence. They've gone on to raise about $1 billion. They've created over 4,000 jobs, and that's pretty good, right? And he's like, yeah, of course it is. And I'm like, yeah, guess what? NC IDEA was created when the state made an equity investment in a tech company, right? And so the whole legacy of NC IDEA came from the state investing in something, realizing that nothing in life is guaranteed. Nothing is. So let's just find the courage to be optimistic, even if it means sometimes holding hands with somebody on the other side of the aisle. So with that, John, I'm going to thank you, and I'll never thank you enough. I consider myself fortunate to count you among my friends. I hope we still have many years working together, and let's try to make that better future together.
All right. We'll do what we can.
Stay connected with NC IDEA on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X, and subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest. Catch new episodes of Ecosysteming every other Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in and being a part of This Thing of Ours.